Hi, welcome to my channel. I am called a lot of things, but mostly Mom, and today on What Would Mom Say, I'm going to talk about what the is vulnerability. Let's get into it. You guys, I have been told for a few years now that vulnerability is a good thing. You should be more vulnerable. You should allow yourself the opportunity to get hurt. And I've been given books by some person named Brenee Brown that I just couldn't read it. I've been told about these books by this lady, I think Brenee Brown, and I don't understand, or I haven't been able to understand, what the is so good about being vulnerable. So the way that I understand vulnerability is that you put yourself in a position where you allow yourself to get hurt. And maybe that's wrong, but that's been my understanding. So don't be judgy. Or be judgy. Don't tell me about it though. I also have had my sister say to me, you know, you're going to really get your kicked if you be vulnerable, and it's the best. I just don't understand what would be the best about having my kicked, you know? You're going to have a hard sell in this lady if you think that I'm going to want that. Until very recently, I haven't been on board with any kind of vulnerability, and I might not be yet, but you know, when the student is ready, the teacher will come. And so in my exploration of how I do things and in how I deal with things and in moving through in moving through to resolution in a different way than I have in the past, I've had to ask myself some questions. One of the questions that I think is really valuable to ask is, what are you unwilling to feel? And so if I ask myself that question, what am I unwilling to feel? Well, one of the major things that I'm unwilling to feel is a beggar. I hate feeling like I have to ask you more than once for something. If I have to ask more than once, then I feel like I'm begging. And if you're not willing to do whatever it is, then you're not willing. But I'm not going to go out of my way begging you for friendship, begging you for your time, begging you for your love, begging you for your adoration. I just don't have time for that, and I'm not going to, and I refuse to be vulnerable in that area. So what am I unwilling to feel? I'm unwilling to feel like a beggar. Anyways, the other thing that I've had to learn about myself is I'm a little bit of a control freak. I like to control situations, and if I can't control the situation I want to control, I will create a situation that I can control, like cleaning my house. I can always control the cleanliness of my house. You want clean toilets? Well, just piss me off. I guess we don't say that. Anyways, so the control freak. All right, let's take that one step further and explore a little bit deeper. And if I look back on my time as a youth, and I became an adult very early in life because I got pregnant at 20 years old. You know, I remember at 14 having this ideal of being married with kids, raising my kids. I was always going to be a mom. I always knew it. I always wanted it, was excited for that part of my life. And it happened a little bit earlier than, you know, probably was best for me. But, you know, what happens, happens. And, you know, it's been lots of years later because I'm in my 40s now. But I had this ideal, and, you know, I did manage to build this ideal where I had the husband and I had the kids and we had a house, and it was this lovely little setup. Now, let's just say, for the sake of example, that this ideal that I build, and maybe you can relate to this in your own life, you build up these ideals. Let's call that the glass house, okay? And so it might not be in the form of your life. Your ideal might be in the form of your perfect day. Maybe you envision that a day is going to go just like this, and let's call that your glass house, okay? So that's your ideal. Maybe you have built an ideal around your education or around a job. Now, what happens when, and we're going to call our ideals these glass houses, what happens when that glass house is shattered? Because let's face it, glass houses are going to break. It doesn't take much to break glass. Glass houses can break easily. So what happens when that glass house breaks? And I'll tell you what happens for me. When my glass house breaks, or when my ideals are burst, I become completely unwilling to revisit that ideal. So if, for example, the marriage broke down, I'm never getting married again. You know, that kind of idea. I'm unwilling to be vulnerable. And that comes back to being unwilling to be a beggar. So the unwilling to step into vulnerability. Why? Because it didn't work the first time. The first time that I built this ideal, the first time I built this glass house, it shattered all around me. Why would I ever rebuild that same glass house? Ever. Yeah, see, nothing. Crickets. Why would I rebuild that? And so, interestingly enough, I built myself this little glass house the other day where I had the idea of a perfect day. And because life is more fluid than a glass house, my glass house broke. And my response to that is anger and frustration and not physical violence, but you know, like I'm ready to fight. I'm ready to fight, you know, the destroyer of my glass house. And here's where the vulnerability part comes in. So the vulnerability part is the willingness to step back into that glass house. And what that looked like was to take a lot of deep breaths and to pray for strength, to deal with it differently, and to really ask myself, what's the worst that can happen if I revisit that glass house, that ideal? If I am surrounded by people who care and love about me, care about me and love me, if I am surrounded by people who want the best for me, if I'm surrounded by people who are there to lift me up, then let's have an opportunity to see if maybe we can repiece some of that ideal together and become vulnerable and engage them in the building process. And so that's what the F vulnerability, I think, looks like to me. It's trusting that people are going to be willing to come back and rebuild. Even though I feel devastated and I feel like it's never getting put back together. Right, it's never getting put back together. Your glass house is never going to be rebuilt the way you built it the first time, but it's not about life and then death. It's not about just building this ideal and then seeing it collapse. You have to add on the life after death part. It's about life, death, life, right? A plant, for example, sprouts this life, and inevitably this plant is going to die. But it's not the end of the road, right? That plant has nutrients and brings forth new life. So here's where we go with the vulnerability. We build these ideals, these glass houses. That's life. They get shattered and broken. That's death. And the vulnerability piece is the willingness to step back into that shattered glass, start rebuilding the pieces, and seeing the new creation form. And that is why we step back into vulnerability. Feels like it took years, yet a second to figure out that lesson. And I'm so glad that, I feel like maybe the boat has touched the shore of where that needed to go for myself. Because what am I unwilling to feel? It's hard to not revisit that. It's hard to not rebuild glass houses, but like I said, it's not about life and then death. It's life, death, life. It's ideals, it's glass houses, the breaking of your ideal, and then the rebuilding of a new and better version. Anyways, you guys, that's all I have to say about that. I love you guys. Take care. Go be awesome and amazing. And I hope that when you're ready as a student, your teacher will show up. I love you. Bye. And I have to give a giant shout out to my 20-year-old son who, took a minute to dive really deep into that with me earlier today. And thank you very much. And a big shout out to my friend Christine who dove into that with me. And a shout out to my sister who loves Brenee Brown and vulnerability. She does forgiveness way better than I do. And a huge shout out to my partner who's willing to rebuild houses.